The snow came down over the churchyard at Marbury in the last grey hour before dark, and a woman with nothing to her name knelt in it beside a man she had never met. He had fallen in the lane 2 days before, an old traveller in a good coat gone to ruin, and no one in the village had stopped for him but her. She had no roof of her own, she had no bread but what the curate left at the vestry door. She had only her 2 hands, raw and reddened at the knuckles, and she had laid them against the stranger's burning brow, as though warmth alone might be argued into staying. Her name was Eleanor Vane, and the season had decided long ago what she was: a widow without a settlement, a gentlewoman without a guinea, the wife of a lieutenant drowned off the Spanish coast before he could send a penny home, and the daughter of a vicar buried with his debts still open. To Marbury she was the woman who slept in the Lychgate shelter and asked for nothing, which the village found easier to pity than to mend. They called her, when they called her anything, the beggar at the church wall. She had heard the words through the chink in the boards, and had not flinched because flinching cost more than she could spare. What none of them knew, kneeling there in the failing light, was whose breath she was trying to keep inside a dying body. She did not know it herself. She would not know it for a long while yet. Stay with her a moment, and you will see the whole of it before she does. The man stirred under her hands and spoke a name that was not hers. She gave him water from a cracked cup, and told him he was not alone, which was the one true thing she had left to give. His fever had climbed all afternoon. She had carried him on a borrowed handcart from the lane to the disused tithe barn behind the church, where at least the wind could not reach him, and she had begged a half-bundle of kindling from the smith's wife and built a fire that smoked more than it warmed. Now she sat in the orange flicker of it and watched a stranger's face, and did the arithmetic of how long a man might last on so little. He was perhaps 60, though hardship made guessing hard. His hands had been soft once. There was a ring on the smallest finger, a worn band of gold, with a crest she could not read, and she did not try to take it, though selling it would have fed her for a season. His coat had been cut by a London tailor before the elbows wore through. Whatever he was, he had come down a long way to lie in a Northamptonshire barn, with a beggar for his only nurse. She did not ask him how far he had fallen, she only kept the fire alive. For 3 nights she did not properly sleep. She wrung out cloths in melted snow and laid them across his chest. She tipped broth between his lips when the curate's wife, shamed at last by the sight of her, sent a covered bowl across the yard. She held his shoulders when the cough racked him and she spoke to him, low and steady in the dark, the way she might once have spoken to a child had the years allowed her one. On the 2nd night he opened his eyes and looked at her with a sudden terrible clarity, and said, "You are not afraid of me." She said there was nothing left in her to be afraid with, and he laughed a dry, broken sound, and told her that was the first honest thing anyone had said to him in 20 years. His name, he told her, was Henry. He did not give a surname, and she did not press for one. A man dying in a barn was permitted his privacies. He spoke in fragments across the long hours of a house he had left, of a son he had wronged, of a wife long buried whose forgiveness he had never asked for in time. He wept once, without sound, and she pretended not to see, because some grief wants a witness, and some wants only the dark, and she had learned to tell them apart. She did not know that the son he named in his sleep was a man whose name had frozen drawing rooms across 3 counties. She knew only that the dying are owed gentleness, and that she had nothing else to pay her own way through the world. On the 4th morning the fever broke, and for a single hour Eleanor allowed herself to hope. He took broth without coughing. He asked the date, and seemed satisfied by it. He looked at her in the grey light and asked her name, and when she gave it, he repeated it twice, Eleanor Vane, as though committing it to a ledger he meant to settle. Then he reached into the lining of the ruined coat and drew out a folded paper, sealed with a smear of red wax pressed by a thumb rather than a ring, and he closed her fingers around it with both his hands. "Keep this," he said. "Not for the money, for the truth in it. Promise me you will carry it to Ravensmore, and put it in his hands yourself." She promised because you do not refuse a dying man, and she did not ask who he was or what Ravensmore might be. She tucked the paper into her bodice against her skin and went to fetch fresh water. When she came back, he was gone. He had died in the half-hour. She was at the well quietly, the way he seemed to have wanted, with the fire still warm and the snow still falling, and a beggar's promise folded over his heart. Eleanor sat with him until the curate came. She closed his eyes herself. She did not weep, not because she did not grieve, but because grief had become a country she visited so often. She no longer marked the border. She had nursed a stranger to his death for nothing, and she would have done it again. And that was the whole of who she was, though no one in Marbury would ever have believed a beggar capable of it. They buried Henry in the pauper's row at the edge of the churchyard, with the parish paying for the box, because Eleanor had nothing and the ring had gone with him into the ground, at her insistence, for it was not hers to sell. The curate read the words over him, in the cold. 3 mourners stood at the graveside, the curate, his shamed wife, and the beggar at the church wall, and only one of them had held the man's hand while he died. When it was done, Eleanor walked to the lich gate, sat in the shelter that was not a home, and took out the folded paper. She did not break the seal. A promise to carry a thing was not a promise to read it. Yet on the outside, in a hand that shook, the dead man had written a single word, and the word was Ravensmore. And beneath it, smaller, as if he had not been sure he had the right to write it, the words "my son." Ravensmore lay 40 miles to the north, and Eleanor had no carriage, no coin for the post, and no boots that would survive the journey whole. She had a promise. She set out walking the next morning with the paper against her heart, and the curate's wife's third-best shawl about her shoulders, given at the last with eyes that would not meet hers. The road north climbed into bare hills where the snow lay longer. She slept in haylofts when farmers allowed it, and under hedges when they did not. She ate what was given, and went without when nothing was. By the time the chimneys of Ravensmore rose gray against a grayer sky, 8 days had passed, and the woman who came up the long avenue of leafless oaks looked precisely like what the world had named her, a beggar, mud to the hem, hollow at the cheek, asking at the great door of one of the proudest houses in the north for an audience with its master. The master of Ravensmore was Julian Hartley, Earl of Ravensmore, and the county had a settled opinion of him. They said the Earl had a heart of carved stone. They said he had not danced in 9 years, had not laughed in longer, had dismissed 3 stewards for sentiment, and turned away every matchmaking mother who had tried the long avenue before Eleanor. He was 38, tall and severe, with dark hair going iron at the temples, and eyes the gray of slate under rain, and he wore his coldness the way other men wore a coat, as the first thing the world saw, and the last thing it questioned. He had buried a wife. He had buried before her every soft thing he might once have been. To the county he was simply the coldest lord in England, and the county said it almost with pride, the way one boasts of a hard winter survived. He did not receive beggars. His butler, a careful man named Pell, told Eleanor as much at the door, not unkindly, and would have sent her to the kitchen for bread and the road after it, had she not said the one word that stopped him. She said Ravensmore was not asking for the Earl. Ravensmore was carrying something to him from a man named Henry, who had died in a barn at Marbury, with the Earl's name on his lips. Pell's careful face changed. He told her to wait in the cold of the hall, and he was gone a long time. And when he came back, the change had deepened into something like fear, and he said the Earl would see her now. The room she was shown into was a library, floor to ceiling with books bound in leather, gone amber with candlelight, a fire roaring in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, and at the far end, standing with his back to her and his hands clasped behind him, the Earl of Ravensmore. He did not turn at once. She stood on the threshold with the mud of 40 miles on her hem, and waited, because waiting was a thing she knew how to do. When he turned, his face was the face the county had described, still as ice, over a river, giving nothing. His eyes went over her once, the plain shawl, the worn shoes, the hollow cheek, and she watched him file her under the heading, "The world had already chosen," and saw the small contempt settle at the corner of his mouth. A vagrant, he said, not to her but to Pell, as though she were a parcel wrongly delivered. "You let a vagrant into my library." Eleanor did not lower her eyes. She had stopped lowering her eyes a long time ago when she understood it. Bought her nothing. She reached into her bodice and drew out the paper, soft now from 8 days against her skin, and she held it out across the length of the room. "I made a promise to put this in your hands myself," she said, "and I have walked from Marbury to keep it. Then I will be no further trouble to you." Her voice did not shake. That surprised him. She saw it surprise him. The smallest flicker behind the slate, gone before it could be named. He did not come to take it. He let her cross the room to him, a test perhaps, or simply the habit of a man who made others come to him, and she crossed it, with the mud trailing behind her on his Turkey carpet, and put the paper into his hand. His fingers were cold. She noticed that, and thought it a strange thing to notice. He looked at the single word on the outside, Ravensmore, and then at the smaller words beneath. "My son," and Eleanor watched the coldest lord in England go absolutely still, the way the surface of a pond goes still in the instant before the ice gives way beneath a weight it cannot hold. He knew the hand. She saw that he knew it. He turned the paper over, and his thumb found the smear of red wax and pressed it as though to read by touch what his eyes refused. And when he spoke, his voice had lost the contempt and found nothing to replace it but a roughness he could not hide. "Where did you say he died?" "Marbury," she answered. "In a barn behind the church. He had fallen in the lane, and no one would stop." "Who nursed him?" the Earl said, still not looking up. Eleanor was quiet a moment. "I did," she said. "There was no one else." The Earl of Ravensmore sat down. He did not seem to decide to. Simply was no longer standing in a chair beside the fire, the paper in both hands, and he stared into the flames for so long that Pell began to edge toward the door, and Eleanor wondered whether she ought to have gone without speaking at all. When he looked up at last, he looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not the mud, not the shawl, but the woman inside them, who had walked 40 miles to keep a promise to a stranger. "Sit," he said. It was a command, level and low, the way he said everything. Yet it was not the command she expected. He had not told her to leave, he had told her to stay. She sat. A maid was sent for, and tea, and the Earl asked her to tell him everything, from the lane to the grave, and Eleanor told it plainly, leaving out only the loneliness, which was hers and not the dead man's to share. She told him of the fever and the borrowed handcart and the broth the curate's wife had finally sent. She told him of the things Henry had said in the dark, of the house he had left, and the son he had wronged, and she watched the Earl's jaw tighten at the word son, and did not understand yet that she was speaking to the very wound she described. She told him of the ring buried with the body because it was not hers to sell, and at that the Earl's eyes came up sharp and held hers, and something moved behind them that she had no name for, and he said, "You could have sold it. You had nothing. Why did you not sell it?" And Eleanor said, "Because it was not mine." As though that were the whole of it. As though it were the simplest thing in the world. It was not the simplest thing in the world. It was, the Earl was beginning to understand, the rarest thing he had encountered in 9 years of being lied to by every soul who approached his door. He had been so long surrounded by people who wanted that he had forgotten there were people who would not take. He looked at the beggar in his library, at the mud on his carpet, and he felt the ice he had so carefully maintained develop somewhere, far down, a single thin crack. He did not show it. He had 30 years of practice in not showing things. Even so, it was there. The paper, when at last he opened it that night alone, told him what he had refused to know for 20 years. His father, the man who had gambled away the family's good name and abandoned a sick wife and a boy of 10 to a creditor's mercy, the man Julian had spent his entire ordered life becoming the opposite of, had not died in disgrace abroad as the family had given out. He had lived poor and penitent, moving from parish to parish, and he had written, in a dying hand, the the one confession he had never had the courage to make aloud, that he had wronged his son past any forgiving, that he asked none, that the cold his son wore was a cold he had taught him, and that of all the debts he was leaving unpaid, that was the one that would not let him rest in the pauper's ground where he belonged. He had signed it Henry Hartley, and below the name the words, "Give the woman who carried this whatever she will take, for she took nothing from a dying man, and that is more than I deserved from anyone. My son, least of all." Eleanor was given a room that night, a real room with a fire and a bed and a door that locked from the inside, and she stood in the middle of it for a long while, not knowing what to do with so much space. She had meant to be gone by morning, promise kept, debt to the dead discharged, back to the road and the lich gate, and the only life the world allowed her. Yet in the morning, a maid brought hot water and a clean gown of good plain wool left for her, the maid said by the Earl's order, and when Eleanor went down, she found the Earl in the breakfast room, and tried to thank him, and to take her leave in the same breath. He cut across both. "Stay until the thaw," he said, not looking up from his letters. "The roads north are death in the snow. You will eat in the morning room. You will not leave until I am satisfied you will not die in a ditch the week after I let you go." It was, she would understand later, a command that was a kindness, wearing the only clothes he owned. At the time it sounded like an order, and she received it as one, and stayed the county noticed. Of course the county noticed everything that happened at Ravensmoor, starved as it was for any motion in that frozen house. Within a week, it was known that the Earl had taken a woman in off the road, and within 2, the knowing had curdled into something uglier. The chief curdler was the Dowager Lady Ravensmoor, Julian's aunt by marriage, a woman of 60, who had run the social affairs of the family since his mother's death, and who regarded the great house as a property held in trust for the proper sort of people. She arrived in her traveling carriage on the 10th day unannounced, and found Eleanor in the morning room with a book, and she stood in the doorway and looked at her the way one looks at a stain on good silk. "So," the dowager said, "this is the creature. The beggar my nephew has installed beneath his own roof. How very like Henry's blood to forget what it owes the name." She said it to her companion, a thin, nervous woman who carried her smelling salts, but she said it loudly enough, and the word beggar landed in the warm room exactly as it had landed through the boards of the lich gate. And Eleanor set down the book and stood, because she would not be insulted sitting. The dowager had a candidate. Naturally. She had always had a candidate. Her name was Lady Sophia Carteret, the daughter of a marquis, 23, accomplished and possessed of the kind of polished beauty that photographs poorly onto the soul. Lady Sophia had been brought north twice already in 3 years, and twice been frozen out at the library door, but the dowager was a patient general, and the arrival of a beggar in the field had given her a clarity of purpose. She had lacked. A man who would take in a vagrant was a man whose judgment had slipped. A man whose judgment had slipped wanted managing. She would manage him to the altar with Sophia before the thaw, and she would have the beggar back on the road, and the name would be safe. She began that very evening at dinner. She seated Lady Sophia at the Earl's right hand, where the woman could display her French and her music and her flawless management of a fish course, and she had Eleanor seated far down the table among the poor relations, and she steered the conversation with the skill of long practice toward the dangers of misplaced charity, the diseases the lower orders carried, the way a soft heart in a great man was an open door to every grasping hand in England. Eleanor said little. She had learned that silence was the only armor that fit her. The Earl at the head of his table said less, and the dowager mistook his silence for agreement, which was the first mistake she made, and not the last, for the Earl was watching. He watched Lady Sophia laugh at things that were not funny, and praise wine she had not tasted, and speak of the poor as one speaks of weather, a nuisance to be endured by the comfortable. And he watched, far down his own table, a woman in plain wool eat slowly and carefully, as one eats who has known hunger, refuse the wine with a small steady gesture, and slip a roll into her sleeve, when she believed no one observed her. Not from greed, he understood at once, but from the long habit of a body that did not trust the next meal to come. The contrast was not lost on him. It was, in fact, the most eloquent thing said at his table that night, and not a word of it was spoken. Later, when the ladies had withdrawn and the Earl sat alone over a glass, he did not drink. He sent Pell to the morning room with a covered plate, bread and cold meat, and a wedge of good cheese, and the instruction that it was to be left without comment. Eleanor found it on the table beside her book. She understood what it meant and what it spared her, that he had seen the roll go into her sleeve and had chosen to feed her openly, rather than let her steal in shame, and she sat with the plate untouched for a long time, because kindness, when you have gone without it as long as she had, is harder to swallow than hunger. That was the first of the commands that were not commands. There would be others. She did not yet know to listen for the protection inside the order, but her body knew. Her body had begun, against all sense, to listen for his step in the corridor. The days grew a shape. The Earl, who had not willingly shared a room with anyone in 9 years, found reasons to be where Eleanor was. He came to the library when she read there and pretended to want a book. He found her in the long gallery before the portraits, and told her in his level voice the names of the dead Hartleys on the walls, and his father was not among them, and she understood the gap and did not mention it. He took to riding out and returning by the path that passed the morning-room window, and if she happened to be at the glass, he would touch his hat, the smallest courtesy, the kind a man pays an equal. The county would have been scandalized to see the coldest lord in England touch his hat to a beggar. The county did not see. Only Eleanor saw, and the maid who carried her water, and the maid told the kitchen, and the kitchen began quietly to take a different view of the woman in the morning-room. He learned things about her in pieces, as she had learned about his father. That she had been a vicar's daughter and could read Latin better than he could. That her husband had been 3 years dead and had left her nothing but the debt the Navy would not honor. That she had buried her father and her mother and a brother at sea and had run out at the last of people to bury and money to bury them with, and had walked out of her old life one morning because staying meant the workhouse and walking meant at least the sky. She told him these things flatly, without appeal. When he asked, and refused to tell him any of it, when he did not, she would not be pitied. He found he respected that more than he had respected anything in years. It was the child who undid the last of his defenses. Though there was no child of his own in that house, only his late sister's daughter, a girl of 7 named Clara, who had been left to Ravensmoor's guardianship, and who lived a shy and overlooked life in the nursery wing with a governess who drank. Eleanor found the girl by accident, weeping in the cold gallery over a doll with a broken face, and instead of passing on, she sat down on the floor in her good plain wool and gathered the child and the broken doll into her lap and set about mending the one and soothing the other with the same raw, reddened hands that had nursed a dying man. She did not know the Earl had come to the gallery door. She did not know. He stood in the shadow of it for a quarter of an hour, and watched a beggar give his orphaned niece more tenderness in 15 minutes than the child had received in the 2 years she had lived under his roof. He did not interrupt. He went away silent. That night he dismissed the governess who drank, and the next morning he asked Eleanor, in the flat voice that hid everything, whether she would consent to sit with Clara in the afternoons. It was framed as employment. It was the beginning of something he did not yet have the courage to call by its name. So Eleanor stayed past the thaw, though neither of them spoke of the thaw when it came. She taught Clara her letters and her sums, and how to mend a doll so the mend did not show. She read to the child in the long evenings, and the Earl took to coming to the nursery wing, on the pretext of bidding his niece good night, and would stay, standing by the door, listening to a beggar read Latin to an orphan, in a voice gone soft at the edges, and Eleanor would feel his presence at her back the way one feels the sun come out, and would not turn, and would lose her place on the page, and would find it again, and the child between them would fall asleep, and the fire would settle, and none of the 3 of them would say the thing that was filling the room. The dowager, frozen out of the great house's slow change, laid her plans more carefully. If charity had softened the Earl, scandal would harden him again, for nothing recalls a proud man to his pride like the threat of ridicule. She let it be known, in the careful poisoned way of her kind, that the Earl of Ravensmore was keeping a woman of no name and lower morals beneath his roof, under the transparent fiction of a governess, that the woman had inveigled her way in with a forged letter and a sad story, and that any house that received the Earl now received the scandal with him. She timed it to the Ravensmore Winter Ball, the great fixed event of the northern season, which the Earl had not cancelled in 9 years of not attending it, leaving the Dowager to host in his name. This year she meant to make the ball the stage on which the beggar would be exposed and expelled before the whole county, and the Earl recalled to his senses, and to Lady Sophia in the same public stroke, the trap was well laid. 3 days before the ball, the Dowager came to Eleanor in the morning-room, alone this time, and laid out the whole of it, with the frankness of a woman who believes she has already won. "You will be at the ball," she said, "because my nephew in his folly has insisted upon it." "Good. Let the county see you. Let them see precisely what you are, a beggar in a borrowed gown, and let them draw the only conclusion available to them. My nephew will not survive the ridicule. He will do what proud men do. He will cut you to save himself, in front of all of them, and you will go back to the church wall you came from, and the natural order will resume. I tell you this not from cruelty, but from kindness, so that you may leave quietly tonight and spare yourself the spectacle. The carriage is at your disposal until midnight. After that you are on your own road, as you have always been." Eleanor listened to all of it without sitting down. When the Dowager had finished, Eleanor said only that she had given her word to stay until the Earl released her, and that she did not break her word for the convenience of those who found it inconvenient. The Dowager smiled, because she had expected nothing less, and it changed nothing, and she gathered her skirts and left, and Eleanor stood at the window a long time after, looking out at the snow, and let herself for one unguarded moment feel afraid. Not of the ridicule. She had been ridiculed before and had survived it. She was afraid of the thing the Dowager had named, so precisely, the cut, the public turning away, the Earl choosing his pride over the soft thing growing between them, because she had begun, against every lesson the world had taught her, to hope, and hope was the one wound she did not know how to nurse. She almost left. She had her shawl in her hand, and the morning-room door half open at midnight, the Dowager's carriage, waiting in the cold, as promised, and she stood on the threshold for a long while, with her heart going hard in her throat. What stopped her was not courage. It was the sound, down the corridor, of the child crying out in a dream, and the knowledge that if she went there would be no one to go to Clara but a house full of servants who were paid not to love her. Eleanor closed the door. She went to the child. She sat on the edge of the small bed, and smoothed the hair from the damp little brow, and stayed until the crying eased into sleep. And somewhere in that hour, she understood that she had already chosen, that she had chosen the moment she sat down on the cold gallery floor, and that whatever the ball cost her, she would pay it, standing up. The night of the ball. Ravensmore blazed for the first time in 9 years. Every window threw gold across the snow. The county came in its furs and its diamonds, climbing the long avenue between flaming torches, and the great house that had sat dark and frozen at the heart of the country for the better part of a decade opened its doors and its ballroom and its long shrouded chandeliers. And the orchestra the Dowager had engaged struck up in a room that had not heard music since the old countess died. The Dowager stood at the head of the room in gray silk and the family diamonds, Lady Sophia at her side in ice blue, and surveyed her battlefield with satisfaction. The Earl had not yet come down. The beggar had not yet appeared. The Dowager had arranged for both to happen at the worst possible moment, and she had arranged the crowd to bear witness. Eleanor came down the great staircase in the plain good gown the Earl had given her. No diamonds, no plumes, her dark hair simply dressed. And the room did exactly what the Dowager had designed it to do. It turned. It looked. The whispers ran along the walls like fire along a fuse. The beggar, the vagrant, the Earl's charity case. Look at her. No jewels. No people. Who let her come? Eleanor walked into the center of all of it, with her chin level and her raw hands still at her sides. And she did not look for a friendly face, because she did not expect to find one, and the dowager watched her from the head of the room, and prepared to spring the trap, waiting only for the earl to descend so that the cut might be made before its proper audience. The earl descended. He came down the staircase in black, severe and tall, and the room turned to him as it had turned to Eleanor, and the dowager stepped forward with Lady Sophia on her arm to make the introduction that would begin the public correction, and she said, in a voice pitched to carry, "Nephew, the county has come to welcome you back to the world. And we were all of us just remarking on the curious charity that has lately become the fashion at Ravensmoor. Perhaps you would care to explain to your guests the presence of the person at the foot of the room." She gestured at Eleanor with her fan. The room held its breath. This was the moment. This was the cut offered to the earl on a silver salver, the chance to disown the beggar and save his name with a single cold sentence, and every soul in the room leaned in to hear him take it. The Earl of Ravensmoor looked at his aunt. He looked at Lady Sophia in her ice-blue silk. He looked down the long, bright room at the woman in the plain gown who had walked 40 miles to keep a promise to his dying father, and had refused to sell a ring that would have fed her, who had nursed a stranger for nothing and mended a broken child for less, and who stood now at the foot of his ballroom with her chin level and her hands raw, and asked nothing of him, as she had never asked anything of anyone. And the crack that had run through the ice that first night in the library reached, at last, all the way to the surface. He crossed the room. He did not hurry, and he did not speak. He walked the whole bright length of it past the staring county, and the frozen dowager and the ice-blue rival, and he stopped before Eleanor, and in the absolute silence of a ballroom that had come to watch a beggar destroyed, the coldest lord in England took her raw and reddened hand in both of his, and bowed over it, low. The bow a man gives, the woman he means to marry. This lady nursed my father. To his death, he said. I will not hear her insulted in my house. It was not a long speech. He had never made long speeches. Yet it landed in the held silence like a stone into still water, and the rings of it went out to the very walls. The county heard the word father, the father they had all believed dead abroad in disgrace 20 years, and understood in an instant that the beggar at the earl's hand had been at a Hartley deathbed when no Hartley had. And the moral arithmetic of the room reversed itself between one breath and the next. The dowager's fan stopped at the height of her wrist. Lady Sophia's polished face went uncertain, then blank as she understood that the field she had been brought north to win had closed against her in a single sentence. And Eleanor stood with her hand in both of the earl's and felt the whole machinery of the world she had been crushed beneath shift, all at once, unto a new foundation, and could not for a moment breathe. The dowager tried to recover. She was not a woman who fell at the first blow. The earl turned to her with Eleanor's hand still in his, and he said, level and quiet so that the whole room had to strain and so heard every word, that his father had died penitent and poor in a barn at Marbury, nursed by this lady alone when the family that bore his name had let him be given out for dead to spare itself the shame, and that he, Julian, was done sparing himself anything at that woman's expense. He said the dowager was welcome to remain as his guest as long as she conducted herself as one. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The dowager understood that she had been not destroyed but displaced, said gently and irrevocably to one side, and she inclined her head a half-inch, because there was nothing else left to her, and the long reign of her authority in that house ended, without a single cruel word spoken. The county, which had come to watch a humiliation, found it had been handed a romance instead, and being human and starved of warmth in a hard winter, it chose, after one stunned moment, to be delighted. An old gentleman who had known the earl as a boy was the first to cross the floor, and bowed to Eleanor. A young matron followed. Within the quarter hour, the woman the room had named a beggar was the woman the room could not get close enough to, and Eleanor, who had armored herself for cruelty, found herself defenseless against kindness, and stood among the suddenly warm crowd with the earl at her side and his hand at her elbow, steadying as though he had understood that this of all the nights of her life, was the one she might fall on. He drew her out of the press at last, through the terrace doors into the cold, where the snow had begun again, and the torches hissed against it, and they stood alone on the marble balustrade above the white garden with the music going on warm behind the glass. For a while, neither spoke. The Earl looked out at the snow, and Eleanor looked at the Earl, and the cold air made plumes of their breath, and the thing that had been filling the rooms of that house for weeks stood between them at last, with nothing left to hide behind. "You should not have done it," she said finally. "You have set the whole county against your aunt, for the sake of a woman with nothing." "I have set the county right about a woman who is worth more than the whole of it," he answered, and turned to face her. And the slate eyes that the county swore had no warmth in them were, in the torchlight, not cold at all. "I have been the coldest man in England for 9 years, he said, the words coming slow and level and costing him visibly, because cold was the only safe thing to be. "My father taught me that warmth was a debt that ruined you. He was wrong. I have watched you be warm to a dying stranger and a broken child and an old aunt who insulted you with nothing to gain by any of it, and I find I no longer wish to be cold." He stopped. His jaw worked. Then, in a voice she had not heard him use, he said her given name for the first time. "Eleanor, stay. Not until the thaw. Not as a governess. Stay as the mistress of this house, if you will have a cold man who is trying to learn to be otherwise." She did not answer at once, because the answer was too large for her throat. She looked at him in the snow, the proudest man in the north asking a beggar to be his countess. And she thought of the lich gate, and the church wall, and the long road north, and the folded paper against her skin, and she understood that the dead man had given her, at the last, the one thing no one had ever given her, a place to put her warmth that would not be wasted. "I have nothing," she said. "No name, no fortune, no people. I bring you nothing. You bring me the only thing I have wanted in 9 years, he said. "You bring me someone who will not take." And he raised her raw hand to his lips and kissed the reddened knuckles, the hands the world had pitied, the hands that had held his father through his dying. And Eleanor felt the last of her armor come away, and said yes, in a whisper, into the falling snow. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the chapel at Ravensmoor, with Clara strewing the path with the first snowdrops, and the old gentleman who had bowed first standing as a witness, and the kitchen, who had taken their view of her early weeping frankly in the back pews. The dowager attended in grey, corrected and not destroyed, and was seen, by the spring, to have grown almost fond of the new countess, who treated her with a courtesy she had not earned and so could not resent. Lady Sophia married a viscount in the south within the year, and was by all accounts content, the field having held other prizes. And the county, which had been so sure it knew the coldest lord in England, learned to say instead that the Earl of Ravensmoor had thawed, and to say it warmly the way one speaks of spring after a hard winter survived. On a night the following Christmas, with the snow falling again over Ravensmoor and the windows throwing gold across it, Eleanor sat by the great library fire with Clara asleep against her side and her husband in the chair beside her, and she drew from the writing desk a folded paper soft with handling. The confession of a dying man. She had carried 40 miles to a stranger's door. She had kept it. She had read it once with Julian beside her, and they had wept over it. Together, the son for the father he had spent his life resenting, and the wife for the man whose dying she had eased, without ever knowing whose dying it was. Now she held it in her 2 hands. The knuckles healed at last and soft, and she looked at the single word on the outside, and the smaller words beneath, "My son," and she understood that the dead man had fathered in the end, not only the coldest lord in England, but the warm house she now sat in. That his last penitent act had been to send a beggar up a long avenue with the truth in her bodice, and that everything good in her life had walked in on the back of that one cold errand of mercy. She did not put the paper back in the desk. She rose with the child still sleeping, and crossed to the fire, and her husband watched her without asking, and she laid the folded confession not into the flames, but onto the high mantel between the two candles, where it could be seen, where it would stay. Henry Hartley had asked for no forgiveness. He had been given a home instead. In the warm house his cold errand had built, and Eleanor thought that was the better gift, and the truer, and the kind a man might rest on at last in the pauper's ground 40 miles to the south. The fire settled. The snow came down. The child breathed slow against her side, and the man who had been the coldest in England reached over and took her healed hand in his, and held it, and did not let it go. Thank you for staying until the end of Eleanor's long road north. If her journey moved you, leave a word below for the moment that stayed with you, and let it be a small warmth passed on. Outside the window, the snow went on falling over Ravensmoor, soft and unhurried, covering the long avenue of oaks all the way down to the road. She had walked in on the road she would never have to walk again.